I'm ready.
Okay. All right. Hey, everybody. Hey, everybody. Today I'm here with Justin, who's been doing French with MIA for how long now?
So I've been, well, it's complicated, but I want to say 23 months total studying French, but 1 year specifically with MIA, but it kind of overlaps a little
Oh,
bit. So I'll talk about that maybe in a bit. But yeah, so I would say 1 year with MIA, but 23 months sort of total.
23 months total. Okay. And
Yeah,
yeah,
something
well,
like
I
that.
mean, so you told me right before we started that you're Canadian. Is that why you're starting French, or what are your reasons for it?
Uh, it's complicated. Well, in Canada, it's very common, at least in a lot of Canada, it's common for people to do their education completely in French, even if they're not living in a French part of Canada.
Okay.
So in British Columbia, on the West Coast, there aren't actually a lot of native French speakers, but a lot of people do take their schooling from kindergarten to grade 12. Well, let's say kindergarten to a certain grade completely in French, and then some of their classes in high school completely in French. So instead of taking French class, you would take math, but in French. And that's really common. And so I was in that for from kindergarten to grade 3.
Okay.
Reason I moved to a different school, and at that age, language is very fragile, I think. And
Mm-hmm.
if it's not being reinforced, it just disappears completely. And
Okay.
so I lost it after only about a year or two. I completely lost it, and then I started again in high school, just regular, I guess, ordinary French classes for about 5 years. But after I graduated high school, I didn't do anything in French for 12 years and completely forgot it again.
Okay. Dang.
So in a way, French has always kind of been there, and I've always kind of wanted to. In a way, I always felt a little bit of loss because I never studied. I never actually fully went through that immersion system and never completely finished it. I
Right.
mean, I don't regret it now in hindsight because I have issues, I think, with that system, but it's always been kind of there, and I've always kind of wanted to get into it. And then out of kind of a whim, it kind of just started again a couple of years ago. So that's why. So it's not really a Canadian thing, although more and more as I get into it, it's something I have to think about because not that I've addressed, not that I've dived into too much of French Canadian media yet,
Mm-hmm.
for reasons maybe I'll talk about later. It is a big part of Canada, like and Canadian history. It's such a huge part
Right.
that the conflict between French and English, and it's like pretty unique actually. There's pretty much no other country where it's French and English in one country, right? Because
Yep.
usually it's between border countries, but unique situation of France starting colonies in Canada, and then the 7 Year War, and then France had to leave, but there was all these French people in Canada, and the British, instead of forcing them to assimilate, kind of decided you'll just have your own colony, and then over time we've just developed this sort of system in a way in Canada. But so yeah, it's French has just kind of always been there, but
Mm-hmm.
um, the question is it's complicated.
Okay. So it's been kind of what integrated into your life in certain parts,
Mhm.
certain epochs of your life, but you
Absolutely, yeah.
restarted 2 years ago,
Yeah,
seriously studying. So, what was the
right.
first year like? You just said that you did 1 year of MIA, and
Yeah.
before that, you had 1 year of. What was that study process
So
like?
I made, yeah. So I made a few cringy videos my first year documenting their progress.
Okay.
Especially just because you look back in hindsight of like
Mhm.
things that you were thinking about and realize I was like way off and like I had bad ideas about certain things. But it all
Mhm.
came
Mhm.
about because I read this book called Fluent Forever by Gabriel Weiner,
Yeah.
and it's pretty popular. It was the first place I was introduced to the input hypothesis, for example, and space repetition. Many things that seem very similar to the mass immersion approach, but in many fundamental ways, it's actually pretty different. And this basic idea is the author realized that like he went to this like summer camp. I think it's called Middlebury, I believe.
Yeah. Middlebury, I
Where
think too.
yeah, we're just completely in the language and starting from zero, and you just sort of make it work. It's sort of like it's kind of like an immersion environment essentially. You just have to figure it out.
Yeah,
And
dude.
when people come out of it, yeah, and when people come out of it, they're fluent. And he's like, wow, this totally worked. And it's
Mhm.
like, I'm going to do it in German first, and then I'm going to do Italian. and I'm going to live in those countries. It's going to be great. And then he realized that, I want to do this for French. And so which is funny because that's what I like.
Yeah.
And so, he's like, oh, I don't have time to actually, I don't know exactly what the reason was, but he had to like prep. Oh, the story goes is that he faked an essay to get into the intermediate program, but
Right.
he faked it too good, and they thought it was, so he put him into the advanced program, and he's like, shoot, now I have to learn French before I actually go to this place where I was going to learn French. So he just basically used Anki, he used frequency lists, and just kind of brute forced vocabulary through sentences, and intuitively learned the grammar that way. And it all sounds great. And when he did his first conversation at Middlebury, he's like, wow, I can actually speak French. I'm thinking in French. This is awesome. And by the end of it, after 6 weeks, he claims he reached a C1 level, or like very high proficiency level. Now, there's a lot of problems with this story. I think people have gone through the process, realized that I think a lot of the things he said were exaggerated. I mean, and I don't think, and like, first of all, he knows Italian, which is like a gigantic step up.
Yep.
There's like a 90% lexical similarity between
Right.
French and Italian, and
Exactly.
a huge grammatical similarity as well. Like that's just not fair. It's not even close. Like, very close languages, but not nearly as close as French and Italian. Like they are sisters, right? They're like, or brothers. Like they're very, very close. Not like in every way. So, but that's not the only thing. I mean, I don't know how good he was at French at the end of that experience, and also just the fact that at Middlebury, like you're mostly talking to students, right? You're not talking to native speakers most of the time. So it's not even really an immersion environment. It's not like dropping into France in a village somewhere and just like have to survive. It's nothing like that, right? And so yeah, so there's a huge problem with that story. And to get back to, I guess, to how I studied, so basically in a nutshell, what you do is take sentences that you want to learn and you use closed deletions. So
okay.
the idea there is that you have on the front of your Anki cards, you have a sentence, and then you blank out the word. So if I want to say, I walked to the store, and you want to learn that word walked, you just blank out walked, and you see that sentence with that blank, and your responsibility when you see the card is just put that word in there. I walked to the store.
Gotcha.
And so you also have a word that says just walked. And your responsibility in the book, it says this, but I'm pretty sure most people did not do this because I actually did it and it was pretty hard. But what you have to do is just repeat the entire sentence that word came from. So if you see that word walked, you have to say, I walked to the store, because that's the context. And really the sentence is the context that gives the meaning really of words. Like words don't really mean anything in isolation, really. And
Right.
that's the idea. And it also reinforces the memories. And so that's what I did basically in a nutshell. You just find sentences. I mean, he has a list of 600 words that are like basic, that are easy to visualize. And so you just put like the word on the front, and you have to just visualize picture in your head what it means. Oh, and another big thing is that he doesn't use English on any of his cards at all whatsoever. And so you basically just use pictures to kind of help you remember what the sentences mean, kind of always be thinking in the target language. And so, yeah, so that's basically it. You just take sentences, you close out words you don't know, you make 2 cards for every word, one with the blank closed deletion, and then one where you have to reply with the sentence. Now, again, there's a lot of problems with this, as probably most people can kind of guess from this. First of all, trying to remember entire sentences, it's pretty mentally taxing. You absolutely can do it, because I did it for like 11 months for hundreds and hundreds of sentences. But it's like really mentally grueling, but with spaced repetition, you actually can do it. Like it is actually literally possible, but it is very mentally grueling. And then what happens is those closed deletions are very easy as a result, because you can actually keep those kind of sentences in your head, and so you can do those closed deletions. And the idea with the closed deletions is that it kind of forces you on, it teaches you grammar, because it forces you to oh, well, what article goes in front of that word? And is it a masculine or is it a feminine article? Or which preposition should you be using this? Because you blank it out. And it's supposed to teach you grammar that way. But talk about later, this isn't really again, as you put it into like an MIA context, this kind of attitude doesn't really make any sense. But that's what I did. Basically, I just kind of started with these 600 basic words. Then I went through the top 1,000 words in French. This probably sounds familiar for people. I found a sentence for each one. I skipped a lot of the cognates just because it was kind of pointless.
Exactly.
And then for every one of those example sentences, any word I didn't know, I made 2 cards, closed deletion for one card, and then just having to reply the entire sentence when prompted with the word.
Okay.
And so it actually was not that bad the first 6 months, because the example sentences typically are pretty easy, right? The cat sat on the table, I walked to school. Those things are pretty, but then the problem is I started to apply this to novels where I would choose it again. I chose a novel and I'm going to go through this whole book. Anytime I see a word, I'm going to memorize that sentence, right? All the words
Oh
in
my
the sentence
God.
and just keep on going.
Right.
And eventually, I will learn enough words and I will then learn the language.
Yes.
Again, you can probably see some problems with this. First of all, novels are written in very poetic and very descriptive ways, and those sentences are really hard to remember. And in addition, a lot of the grammar or like sentence structure in challenging, quite difficult to wrap your mind around. They're not just like sample sentences. Sample sentences are designed to be very easy to understand and to wrap your brain around. Usually there's just one new concept, whereas in a book, there might be like 10 new concepts in one sentence because it's, using metaphorical language, maybe a very long sentence. But I did that with 2 books. I just kind of brute forced it and kind of just forced myself to do it. Ended up making 10,000 cards this way.
Wow. All sentence
10,000 cards.
mine.
But I mean, but again, it wasn't 10,000 words. It was probably closer to about 3,500 to 4,000 words. But just by brute forcing it, essentially, I started with Le Petit Prince, which is The Little Prince, classic French book, and also a book called L'Étranger, or I think it's called The Outsider in English.
Okay.
But the nice thing is those books are very short, which helps a little bit. But yeah, so but there's obvious reasons why this is a pretty bad idea, because it just takes so much mental energy to do this. It took me an hour every day just to learn 50 new words.
Right.
And like I was just completely drained, and I had no energy to do almost anything else, and I didn't really immerse all that much, although I did do a little bit that year. But yeah, so and again, I made a few videos on my channel like talking about this process. And again, I did learn a lot. Like I learned a lot of words, and I did learn a lot of grammar, both naturally and through lookups and stuff. But it's really not a very efficient or effective vocabulary. I mean, like in a way it was, because your brain to like memorize these things, but it was more of a memorization trick in a way rather than actual acquisition, right?
Right.
And that's the difference, right? You're using Anki to memorize these sentences, and the implicit assumption is that will actually help you learn the language. But the actual memorization, it does a little bit, but not worth the effort. Like I spent 300 hours on Anki for those 11 months.
Wow.
So that's just on Anki with not that much immersion. I think I did about I don't actually I did that year, but I always think somewhere between 100. So the proportions are way off, and it was just, it was very mentally draining. And again, I learned a lot. I read those 2 books, very short books, in a very thorough way. I essentially memorized them. Not word, I couldn't recite them, but I essentially memorized huge chunks of those books. But like, again, it's kind of like saying like, I'm going to learn English by memorizing Moby Dick. Like, you could do it, but it's like how much mental strain that would take and how much little results you'd actually get out of it. But that's essentially what I did. I memerized Moby Dick to learn French, at least for the first 11 months. So that was the first 11 months. I actually have documented it just for my own sake, really. But yeah, that was the approach. So there's a lot of flaws in the Fluent Forever method, I think, in terms of Enki cards and immersion. Really the de-emphasis of immersion, even though he does talk about that, he does talk about the input hypothesis. In many ways, it is de-emphasized, and he has this new product that, again, it's mostly focused on the Enki cards, using close relations and stuff. But again, most people who do his method do not do what I did, where they actually literally memorize all these sentences. I'm pretty sure, just because I can't find anyone actually talks about it really online, so I guess I was the only one crazy enough to actually follow his advice, like literally.
Right.
But maybe I shouldn't have followed it quite so literally. So that was the first 11 months of my French journey. Yeah.
Cool. So 2 questions popped up in my mind as you were speaking. At the end of those 11 months, how did you feel in your French? What could you do? What was, and what was your ability level? And number 2, it seems that this was some sort of a conscious effort to learn the language. It wasn't how we as MIAers or AJATTers, immersion learners, know that language is acquired subconsciously, right? So what made you take the leap from Gabriel Weiner's method into MIA? How did you get so-called red-pilled?
Right, exactly. Well, I mean, I think they've actually moved away from that expression just because it's kind of associated with kind of a dark part of the internet,
Right,
actually.
exactly. Yeah.
Completely unrelated to MIA. But I'm
Yes.
like, I always felt a little cringed by that expression because I'm like, don't you realize like the connotations with that? I know they're talking more about the Matrix and stuff,
Right,
but
exactly.
like some really like toxic stuff connected to that
No,
section,
no.
actually.
Yeah.
But great question. Like for one thing, I couldn't read very well, which is weird, right? Because
Mhm.
I had like sentence find these two books, and I actually had read a couple other novels. I just kind of read them sort of freestyle. I just kind of read through them, looked up words once in a while, but I didn't like mind them or anything like that.
Mhm.
And I couldn't read very well at all, really. Like what I was doing is I would look at a sentence and I would think of the definition of words or what they meant. And I thought
Okay.
about the grammar, and I sort of just kind of pieced it together as I went. But it's not really like fluid reading, right? Reading is just reading the words, and they
Right.
sort of just instantly turn into meaning or
Mhm.
instantly turn into pictures in your head. You're not thinking of definitions or grammar whatsoever. Just like when you're listening, right? When you're listening, that's even faster, but that's completely like, I think reading and listening are very similar in a way that they're, when you're reading like in a fluid way, it is almost completely unconscious. It's just, you read the words and it's instantly meaning in your brain. And so when I was trying to read, yeah, I would read it and it would just be very uncomfortable because I'm like, I'm reading it, yeah, I technically know those words, but it's like it wouldn't transfer directly to meaning. I would just sort of like machine out the meaning, I guess, like think
Like
about grammar.
mathematically, yeah.
Kind of, yeah. It's like, again, I wasn't like consciously thinking, okay, this is a conditional mood or whatever. I'm not thinking that exactly, but
Mhm.
I couldn't really read it. And I would say, so yeah, so I mean, I was okay. Like it wasn't bad. I mean, like
Right.
I could kind of like work my way through a text and stuff and understand it and stuff.
Mhm.
But that's in terms of reading. And again, we might talk about this later, but the thing with like speaking is that in a Romance language, you can kind of get away with not being very good and still kind of speak, is the thing. Like you can kind of cheat
Yeah.
because you can just like basically use English grammar and swap out words and like stumble through it, use cognates, like use those too much,
Right.
and you can kind of come across like you actually can speak, because I
You can
actually did a few
communicate.
yeah,
You're
you can
right. Yep.
communicate, but you're gonna be really bad,
Mhm.
and like really unnatural, really cringy, and just like it's not gonna be good. Like I actually did 3 or 4 italki sessions, like one in about 3 or 4 months in,
Mhm.
and then two or three about the 6 or 7 month mark. And I could communicate, like I had hour-long conversations. It was fine. We talked, but in reality, like, you know, talking like one-on-one with someone who's like a tutor who's very sympathetic and trying to make things understandable, like it's not actually that hard in a Romance language when it's read that close to English, because you can rely on so many things like cognates and the relative closeness of grammar, even though the grammar is really different. Like actually, like when you really like get into it, like there's a lot of significant differences between English and French, for example, but you can kind of get away with it. You can kind of fake it and you can have kind of conversations. So in a way, like on the outside, it's like, wow, you read these like real French books and you can have these conversations, and like you can, I mean, my listening comprehension was really bad, but like it kind of on the surface seems like it actually kind of worked, right? But
Yeah.
at the deep down, I'm like, this can't go on forever, right? I can't mentally maintain this. Like I
Right.
could maintain it for 11 months, but I just couldn't mentally maintain it. Like I probably could have done it for a little bit longer, but I knew fundamentally something had to change.
Mhm.
And so to finish my story, I guess, is that along the way, I was always aware of Matt versus Japan's channel, because if you type in anything like language learning and Anki, it's going to come up, or the input hypothesis, it's going to come up, right?
Okay.
So I was always aware of it, and I remember watching his 3-hour video, which was quite interesting. It was like it's a very strange video, right?
It
I don't know if
is.
you've seen it. But
I
it's
have,
like
yeah.
it's very dark. It's very like depressing, but at the same time, it's also very motivational in a way, because he talked about this like regime he's done and like the results he got, and how
Right.
much he hated the language and stuff. So
Mhm.
it's a very like roller coaster of a video. But that was like really interesting, and I watched some few others videos, and I was very like actually. I think he's changed in his tone and about a lot of things, and he's actually, I think, really improved in terms of his content. But at the time, I was like kind of two minds. On the one hand, he had this
Mhm.
very like strange, like monk-like attitude about language learning, like they were like these like secret ninja warriors, like learning
Yeah.
this language away from everyone else, and it was very off-putting in many ways.
Yeah, an
It's like,
adjective cultish was kind of
oh,
thrown around. I
exactly.
remember that. Everyone just said, "Oh, MIA is a cult." But
It is absolutely, yeah. And I mean, it has a lot of like, I mean, if we're being brutally honest, there's a lot of similarities between like immersion learning, like AJATT specifically, I think a little bit more, but even MIA, at least not as much now, I would say, but maybe like before, but like all the hallmarkers, right? Like charismatic leader, kind of like strange terminology, isolation from everyone else,
Oh
like
God.
people like like us versus them, like all these like attitudes, right? And I
Right.
actually heard that the person who started AJATT, I think he actually like cultivated this in many ways. Like he actually read about cults and like use it to like extract money out of people a little bit,
Oh wow.
um, I don't think it's intentional with MIA. I don't think it was intentional or is intentional, and I think it is getting better. But I think it's just kind of an inherent mixture of and the age group and of people who typically learn languages, at least Japanese and stuff.
Hmm.
Um, but sorry if I'm monologuing too much, but
No, man,
I'm almost done. But yeah, so I guess to finish off, so slowly over time, I think I just I was just like, you know what, I'm just gonna try it. Like I can't. I just kind of. I think I just kind of quit cold turkey. Actually, I think what I did know is I think I just decided one day I'm just like, you know what, this can't go on. I think what I did is I stopped making my old cards. I still reviewed my old cards for a while, just because I didn't want to give them up because I made 10,000 and I felt like all this work I didn't want to give it up. But I just kind of started the process of the mass immersion approach. More or less vanilla, and just kind of, and then eventually I just deleted those 10,000 cards and
Gotcha.
never looked back. So, so that's kind of how I made the transition. So it's kind of slow and gradual, but yeah. So don't do what I did, but I mean it worked in many ways. Like I learned a lot of vocabulary, learned a lot of grammar, but it was like extremely mentally grueling and not worth the effort. When I could have actually made so much more progress if I did other methods at the time. So.
Great. All right. So yeah, I don't want to put the cart before the horse, but a lot of people, especially when talking about MIA, they want to know where you're at. So
Yeah.
after you're at the 2 year mark learning French, 1 year with MIA.
Roughly.
Yeah. How do you feel? Would you put yourself on any, B1, B2, C1,
Right. Well,
CEFR scale, or what can you
Well, it's
do?
complicated. Yeah, I mean, I don't like the CEFR scale, honestly, in general. Like, I don't like the way, because even though it doesn't imply like a certain learning structure, it inevitably implies a learning structure that first you have to learn how to ask for directions, and then you have to be able to do this, and then do this. And it's like you build up progressively from there. But in a way, like immersion learning is like the opposite, where you just spend all this time comprehending, but you can't really do anything with it yet
Right.
until you get to a certain level, and then the output starts to rise from that.
Mhm.
But like the idea with the CFR is that you start from the basics, you learn grammar, basic grammar, then you learn slightly more complicated grammar, slightly more vocabulary, and then eventually you get to the top. But it's like but that progressivity of it, I guess, I feel like it's an illusion. I think it's not very helpful for most people, especially self-learners or self-taught learners. But anyways, that's me avoiding the question. But I actually was curious about this. So I can go through like the different skills, I guess, that
Sure. Yeah.
before
Hmm.
reading, speaking, reading, or reading, writing, speaking, and listening, I guess.
Yeah.
So I guess we can start with comprehension because that's kind of the thing first. So I actually have statistics about how much I've listened for the last 11 months.
Sure. Get into it,
So
man.
yeah, so right now I'm at 557 hours for listening, which if you average it out, it's around an hour and a half per day for the year.
Okay.
It was actually lower than an hour and a half average, but I've definitely been doing a lot more conscious listening like in the last few months. So I kind of upped my average. So it averaged out at the year because I wanted to get that hour and a half. I wanted to get
Yeah.
that target. And so it definitely bumped my average. So 557 hours, that's about an hour and a half per day. In terms of listening, I would say listening comprehension is tricky because it really depends on many factors. Like sometimes I'll understand almost every character in a show, but then one new character shows up and I barely understand a single thing they say. Sometimes it's accent. Accent is a huge thing, I think. Like, so listening comprehension, sometimes I can understand full conversations word for word in TV shows. Sometimes, it's mostly just gist level. So it's complicated. I mean, that's the best way I could say it. Like I did the Peppa Pig test to see, like, I just watched an episode yesterday to see how much of Peppa Pig do I understand word for word. And
Right.
I would say I understand Peppa Pig word for word, I would, which is great, I guess. But I miss like a word every once, like every 2 or 3 minutes, not because I don't know the word, but I just, for some reason, the way they said it, my ear, because I haven't watched Peppa Pig at all,
Yeah.
my ear's not quite tuned to the accent quite yet.
Mhm.
So I sure if I watched 100 or 10 hours of Peppa Pig, I'd be able to understand it 100% perfectly.
Okay.
And like, for example, like, not that I'd ever do that, but like anime, for example, like dubbed anime, for example, is significantly easier than live action.
Okay.
So sometimes I can understand it word for several minutes, and then sometimes a new character shows up with a really squeaky voice, and I can really understand it for a while. So it's kind of like I can say for like dubbed anime as an example, or most dubbed content, understand the story when, like almost always. I can understand almost everything they say, but I'm missing details once in a while. And then for live action, again, it really depends on what I'm watching. If I'm watching like I was watching a show called Scam France, which is kind of like a high school drama show with a lot of like a lot of sex and drama and stuff in high school.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can understand word for word everything. It really depends on the character. When it's like a posh character shows up and they speak very properly, I can understand almost everything. But when like the cool girl shows up who like slurs their words and drops like grammar and stuff, or drops slang and stuff, it's like it takes me like 20 hours listening to it to finally tune into to what they're saying. So, and then for some live action stuff, again, it really helps if you've watched it for a while. But yeah, sometimes it's still like I'll watch a TV show, the first episode, I'm like getting nothing. Like not nothing. I can understand it. Sometimes I'm getting sentences and phrases, but it's really rough, just gist level. And it might take me, say, 5 or 6 episodes to kind of tune my ear, and then I can start getting almost everything that they're saying, but still I'm missing key details. So that's the best way I can describe my listening comprehension. I mean, French listening comprehension is hard. Like it's really hard. Like it's like I know like the FSI, I think it's called. They estimate French takes 620 hours of study or something like that.
Right.
I mean, I don't think that. I mean, I don't know what they're using to measure that, but I mean, I'm getting up to that just in listening alone, and I'm gonna be at proficient level in listening.
Yeah.
My current estimate is that it takes about 1,500 hours for listening comprehension. That might be maybe a little bit conservative. Like maybe I'll be better before that, but that's kind of my current goal. Just because I mean it takes a long time. Like the way French people slur their words, how fast they talk, the way they cut their words in half and still say the same thing. Sometimes it's just a blur of noise, and I don't know what French comprehension Spanish listening comprehension is like, but French listening comprehension, I mean, I don't know if you can compare that between languages, but it's not easy. It's pretty hard, and I don't know how you feel about listening comprehension in Spanish, but
Yeah, I could talk about it a little bit. See, I think that the phonemes in French are a little bit more different than in English, so our ears aren't as attuned to it.
yeah,
In Spanish, there's a double R. There's a couple of different letters, but most of it Spanish or native English speaker can pronounce, except for the double R. So that's the
right,
hard part. The speed of Spanish speakers is amazing. Like
right,
you can't even compare it. It's I think someone posted on Seabolt Speaks little Discord the other day a chart of an academic study which listed Japanese as as the fastest language, and Spanish was
right,
right underneath. So in terms
yeah,
of listening comprehension, it I would say 1,500 hours, and that's actually there's a guy named Pablo who runs a channel named Dreaming Spanish, and he put out a chart.
right,
Have you seen it?
right. I've seen that, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I
So
didn't understand the language, but he's very good at making it comprehensible because that's his whole thing. So I
right.
could actually kind of follow with my like relying on cognates between French and Spanish. I could kind of follow what he was talking about. But yeah, the figures, yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah. So 1,500 is like spot on, and that's what I'm aiming
And
for.
yeah, and I've heard actually other anecdotal evidence or testimony that that's still like somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 hours, somewhere in that range, somewhere
Yeah.
is what it typically is. Like I've heard it in multiple places, so that's why I put it at 1,500 hours, just because it feels like you should you should if you've been listening and trying to comprehend stuff and
Hmm.
reading on the side at 1,500 hours, just from the anecdotal evidence. But I also suspect I'm actually below average in terms of understand or like improve my listening comprehension just because I think, like I've also noticed that with music, like training my ear to understand intervals and things like that. I feel like it did not come naturally to me, and it
Hmm.
took me a long time to develop that sensitivity. I'm also not very good at judging accents from people. I noticed, like,
Okay.
where someone's from, or even imitating it as well. Now, I'm not saying that it'll actually change that much in terms of how long it'll take me to comprehend French, like 100% effortlessly,
Hmm.
but it's just something I've thought about, I guess. But yeah, so I still have like over like almost 1,000 hours to go. So
Yeah.
it's like it's hard. It's hard to like emotionally though accept that, because I want
Right.
intellectually I'm like, yeah, I mean, like you can't understand everything because you just haven't put the time in. But emotionally I'm like, you're just garbage at listening. Like you should try harder. And one thing I think that's helped is like if you don't understand something, it's not your fault.
Hmm.
You just haven't given the time, right? And
Exactly.
letting go and like accepting that. I mean, intellectually it makes sense. Emotionally, it can be hard sometimes. But
It really is. Yeah.
so so that's listening. That was my long answer for that. So I guess I can quickly go through the others.
Hmm.
Reading. I don't know about your experience, but reading gets easier so much quicker than listening. Like it's ridiculous how much quicker, and it helps with like the cognates and stuff. But you just breathe on a book and you just improve so quickly. Like it's ridiculous. So I mean, at this point, I've read 35 books in French,
Oh
which
wow.
sounds like a lot, and it sounds like I'm reading tons every day, but I
Hmm.
only read about 30 to 60 minutes a day. And so I'm getting up to around 9,000 pages with 300 words per page. I know like the rule of thumb is 10,000 pages. I don't think that's actually true, though. I think it's going to need a lot more reading to really get to a high proficiency, but I would say I'm pretty good at reading. Like I could probably read most like contemporary novels, maybe with a very occasional lookup, but I could probably just get through it no problem without a dictionary, like a
Oh
contemporary
wow.
novel. Once
Okay.
you start to get a little bit older, then it's starting to get a little trickier. But like I read through this book called, I think it's called The Mystery of Room 622. It's a new French novel that came out. And I would say on average, every 500 or 600 words, I would say I didn't know a word,
Hmm.
which is like, if you actually did the math, that's like 99.5% or comprehension, which
Right.
is more than enough, really. Like you're never going to get 100%, but
Yeah.
in terms of like reading, like I would say my reading has gone way better, and I've read most of this book over the course of a year. So reading,
Okay.
again, it's like I put like a third of the time of my time into reading, and yet it progressed like 10 times
Exponentially.
faster than listening
Right.
comprehension. And I guess that's just the way it goes for every language. But and then quickly, I haven't done a lot of speaking. I've only done 5 conversations on Italki. But
Okay.
again, like I could like I did kind of like I did it only a few days ago just to like kind of see where am I at right now. And like I said, I could talk. My vocabulary is way better than it was obviously like over a year ago when I last had the conversation. And it was kind of fun. Like you're like, oh, I want to say something, and I heard someone say this exactly what I want to say in like a TV show. I'm ready. I can say it now. And
Hmm.
you say it and in the moment, and it felt good because you're like, not only is it like grammatically correct, but this is a very natural way to say it, and
Right.
that you just pull that out of your immersion. You realize that, oh, I know how to say exactly what I want to say. So that felt good. And I mean, so with a sympathetic tutor, I could talk for an hour and it's fine. But again, that's kind of an illusion because like I'm nowhere near fluent because like I'm very survivally fluent, I guess you could say.
Okay.
But I think you could get there in like 3 or 4 months in Romance languages anyway. So so that's
Don't sell yourself short.
well, I mean, again, it's like it doesn't feel this like anywhere close to what it's like in English. Like I'm like it was funny. I would say a sentence, and it's a part of it is like I haven't practiced it yet,
Right.
and like because I have like my potential, and I have to like kind of like if I practice enough, I could get as high as my potential is. But I
Hmm.
don't think my potential is high enough at all, just because my listening comprehension is so low, and I just haven't been able to absorb enough.
Okay.
Um, but like I think my pronunciation is not great, but it's okay. She never misunderstood me, which I guess is fine.
Hmm.
And it was fun. And in terms of writing, I haven't done a lot of writing. Once in a while, I'll do like a tweet, like respond to someone, or like a Reddit comment once in a while when I feel brave, I guess.
Yeah.
Um, but, but yeah, so that's kind of where I'm at with my 4 skills. So I
Awesome.
just haven't really actualized my potential yet in my comprehension, just because I don't think my comprehension is really where I want it to be. So that's it.
Okay, so something interesting came up in my mind. It feels
Yeah,
like we took two different paths in MIA here because
yeah,
you mentioned you read 35 books. I've read a book and a half
yeah.
in Spanish. but
Right.
I have almost 1,000 something hours in listening, and just in passive and active combined.
Yeah.
So it feels like for me that I can still read better than I can comprehend or
Yeah.
listen. But that, I mean, I think that goes with the medium. With reading, you could read at your own pace, but when you're
Yeah.
speaking or when you're
Absolutely.
listening, you
Yeah.
gotta you're just there. You gotta take whatever's coming your way.
Right.
But um, here's a question: do you think
Yeah.
that your reading was the basis of your level of output? Meaning, if you
Mm,
took away all your listening,
right.
but you knew how to pronounce stuff and everything,
Yeah. Yeah.
do you
Yeah.
think that your level would be about the same where it is now, or is the listening a main like what kind of proportion would you put for that
Right.
on
So
the
like, am
importance?
I just relying on the reading that I did and then taking that and sort of turning that into output, like when I'm
Yes,
talking?
right.
I would say like it might be my this is my subjective experience,
Yeah,
so
yeah.
it might actually be wrong, but my subjective feeling is that the amount of reading I did improved my vocabulary so much and allowed me to understand a lot of what I'm listening. Um, but the things that I could say is what I've heard in TV and movies, and
Interesting.
that's what I would say. Now there is a certain sense that like you, I'm sure there's some like things when I would say like that it didn't come off super naturally that I'm just sort of constructing together. I'm like, oh, I know this verb can go with this thing. I can put them together. Like not really like thinking about the grammar exactly, but it's a little artificial putting it together in a way. But I would say that I'm not just taking stuff that I read and sort of turning that coming out of my mouth. That I
Uh-huh.
like because even though I've kind of like downplayed my listening comprehension, I am like hearing lots of phrases and sentences, sometimes full sentences, word for word, and like a lot of the stuff has been, I guess you could say, acquired in the
Hmm.
sense, and like little expressions and like ways to say things, and like the like there's that video Matt did about language isn't math, that there's always a
Yes.
very precise way to say anything.
Hmm.
And there's a lot of stuff like that in French. Like sometimes French feels like it's just a collection of little phrases stitched together, all very idiomatic. And that if you don't know them ahead of time, you're not going to understand a single thing. In many ways, it feels like that. And so, yeah, I would say output has been from listening, as bad as my listening is. But the
Okay.
reading, I think, really just improved my ability um, um,
Choir
to
vocab,
understand,
maybe.
like, yeah, acquire vocab exactly. Because I never did the subtitle thing. I never
Yeah.
actually. I'm actually not very good at reading subtitles, even though I read a lot of books.
Hmm.
Like, it's not instantaneous. Like you kind of, I feel like I understand people who don't like reading subtitles because I think some people like it's like kind of painful, right? To like look at the screen and then look back at the subtitles. And until you're really good at it, when it's like almost like fluid and natural, it's like kind of a pain. So I never did that, and I'm not actually that good at it just because I've never practiced. But I would say, all my vocab is either come from books
Hmm.
or that I just sort of noticed when I was listening. And you actually like learn a lot more vocab than you might think just from listening, just from all
Right.
those like the slang that people use over and over again and little expressions and grammar stuff. Like you learn so much just from listening. And so, yeah, so I would say most that reading and writing and listening and talking, if they feel like they're on different tracks, but
Hmm.
they kind of connect in a way like crisscross, but they feel like you have to listen to speak and you have to read to write, and they sort of mingle, but they're mostly on their own. They're kind of like two different languages almost, but that's what I think.
Wow. Yeah. No. Yeah, I would concur with that, man. I definitely felt that listening, even though it's not conscious. I can't really hear that person saying what it is. I just kind of
Mhm.
know. I kind of know what to say, even though I
Right,
mean I haven't acquired, let's say, the subjunctive as well as I should have in
right,
when I'm speaking Spanish. My output isn't as good as it should be in my
right,
vocabulary, just because I haven't read as much as I should. But
right.
I've had hour-long conversations with native speakers and all that, and they all told me, "Oh, you sound so natural. How did you learn?" They would ask me that. Like, okay,
Right.
I don't feel that good, don't boost my ego here, but
Yeah, yeah,
um
yeah.
yeah, I felt that listening was real honestly the main driver. I mean, that does line up with the
Right.
human experience, right? That's how everyone learns a language. You listen.
Yeah, I mean, I think deep down, listening comprehension is like the most important thing of like. I mean, reading is awesome. It's one of the main things I like about French. Honestly, reading books is what I like. And so, but I think deep down, if I only could read books but can't understand like a simple TV show, I'll feel pretty bad.
Yeah.
So like, I feel like like, and I don't. So I feel like I have to put in the time. And you know, it is awesome to talk to people in like their language and really understand it and like get their jokes and like communicate, and that's all great. And yeah, so but I mean like, and it's I don't know, but like I guess we could talk a little bit about listening comprehension and like what that experience is like, because you know, there's this thing where like you'll hear a word and don't know what it means,
Hmm.
but then once you hear it once, it's like you can never not hear it ever again.
Yeah.
And then especially, it's like I don't know if they have this in Spanish, but there's a lot of little phrases in French that can mean many different things depending on the context. And
Hmm.
it takes me like so long. It's like I'll hear there's an expression called that's quand même in French, which I can't really explain it intellectually, honestly, because I understand it in the moment, but it's
Right.
depending on the context, like it means very different things. And like, but I'll hear it once and I'm like, okay, what is that? And I'll look it up. I'm like, I don't understand this, but it's like, okay. And so I'll keep on listening, hear it again. I still don't understand it, but eventually it's like from context, I eventually get it, but I just have to hear it once. And then my brain sort of never lets it go. And
Right.
then until I eventually understand it. And I've heard that like a lot of things, like I'll just, for whatever reason, out of the blue, I'll hear a word. And
Hmm.
then once I hear it, it's like, eventually I know that word is eventually I'm going to understand it. I just have to, my brain has to eventually just like latch onto it and then reel it in. But I don't know if that's kind of similar to your experience with listening comprehension.
Yeah, definitely. I've had it's weird. I'll just be like doing whatever, you know. I'll be living my life, walking around,
Yeah,
doing
yeah,
whatever, and a phrase will come up to my mind. I wouldn't know the meaning of it. I wouldn't know like,
right,
you know, I just don't know the
yeah,
meaning of it. But I would hear it.
right,
I would hear it and I'd be like, "What is this?" And I would look it up and be like, "Okay." And it's weird, you know. I'm not consciously listening to Spanish. I'm not doing anything in
yeah,
Spanish. I'm living my life and something pops up to the subconscious. It just bubbles up
right,
and you learn it, you know. So i
yeah,
think
yeah,
i think immersion kind of it's a weird analogy, but it kind of carves out its own space in the subconscious, you know, just with the language,
right,
and things will bubble up to your
yeah.
consciousness, and that's how you learn it. Or, you know, the learning is conscious but the acquisition is subconscious. It's kind of a weird thing, but you know, it's there. Once you immerse, you have it. You kind of have it in you. You know, the language
Yeah.
becomes a part of you, and
Oh,
that's what I keep hearing. That's the common occurrence with all
mhm.
immersion learners. You know, I don't know what you have to say about it.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, exactly. And like, I feel like there's a very big difference between knowing a word when you read it and knowing a word when you hear it. I feel like when you hear it and understand it, it really does feel like deep down in your bones that you know this from now on, and you will never not hear it or
Yeah.
understand it for pretty much forever. Like that's what it really does feel like. Whereas when you read a book and you hear read one of those like literary words, and you're like, yeah, I understand it, I get in this context, but it really doesn't feel quite as real. It doesn't really feel as internalized as if you hear it and understand it like instantly in the split second that someone like said it in like a fast sentence. It really does feel deep down in your bones. And I guess again, because language is sound ultimately, like that's what it is. And
Yep.
you know, when we write, it's like an abstract representation of that sound, but
Right.
deep down, it just sound. And so that's probably why I think listening comprehension is so important. But yeah, it's like deep down, like that's the stuff that you can hear and understand instantly. That's the magic. That's like the real learning that happened. Yeah, I would agree.
Cool. So if you would go back, would you change your proportion of listening to reading by any sort of
In the
significant
last,
amount?
I mean, in the last year.
Yeah, the last year.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I don't think so. I don't think. I mean, this is like the conflict I have. Right. It's like I'm like, you know, I keep on reading, keep on getting my reading so much better, but because I don't like, even though I like, it may come across like I don't think I'm actually where I want to be when it comes to reading. Like I'm not. It is still a lot of work to read. Like it's a lot of mental effort. It's kind of like the difference between a well-oiled machine and one that's kind of rusty. It
Hmm.
feels still very rusty to read a book. Even
Okay.
if it's like I know all the words or I know all the grammar technically, it still feels like my brain is like chugging along. Kind of, it's more work than English, definitely.
Right.
And so I definitely want to get to the point where it's like effortless and instantaneous, and it's like literally as good as English. That may not be. I mean, I think it's hypothetically possible, um, um, but I don't think I would change it, just because for one thing, I think reading is my main motivator in the sense that That's what excites me. Like of all my immersion, reading is what, like, listening I do, and I try and find things that entertain me, but reading is like the most intrinsic, powerful goal I think I have in learning French. So I don't think I would change it for that, even though it might be technically less efficient. And also, and this is the one thing I've thought about a lot of, like, did I like kind of screw myself over by not doing the subtitle thing for a little bit to just kind of get used to like what is everyday conversation like, and what are those little phrases that they use all the time, and then just get that in me first, and then do more novel reading, and rather than just do the listening, basically just figure it out, just from listening alone. And I actually go back and forth on that because so much of the words I hear, it's because I read it in a book once, and then now I understand what they said as a result. That's happened like so many times, like every day. So I'm like, I don't think I would change it in the sense that, but I don't know. I guess it's hard to go back, but I don't think I would change anything about how I did it. I think, it's frustrating that my listening comprehension isn't where I want it to be, but that'll get better in time. Like if I put in 2 hours a day, that's about 700 more hours next year. So I'll be about 1,200 hours. So next year I should be pretty far along, and maybe not quite exactly where I want, but pretty close. So I don't think I'd change anything though. Would you change your approach at all to listening or reading?
Yeah, I definitely would. Like I said, I haven't read as much as I should be. It was, I mean, my motivation is interaction with people. I did a lot of, most of my reading, you could say, was just chatting on HelloTalk. I would actually output, meaning I would write or text people in basic Spanish, whatever, and
Right.
I would use, if I didn't know anything, I would just use the translate on HelloTalk. I'm a
Yeah,
VIP, so-called VIP,
oh,
and
cool.
there's unlimited translation. So I would just be like, all right. The goal is just to communicate and see
Right.
what they're saying. Other than that, I read a book and a half. I read The Alchemist, and I'm getting through
Nice.
Atomic Habits by James Clear in
Cool.
Spanish.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would probably set my reading proportion to about 30% of my immersion. So read a
Right.
lot more. The
Yeah.
only trouble is finding content.
Right.
Obviously, that's the
Yeah.
main issue with a lot of language learners.
Absolutely.
And I usually have a lack of focus. I kind of like to veg out and just sit and watch
Yeah.
things rather than kind
Yeah.
of actively read. So
Yeah.
I guess different strokes for different folks. But yeah, I know reading would have definitely increased my level of where I'm at right now.
Right. Yeah. I mean, like this is well, maybe atomic habits will help. But one thing I do is uh, like it's I always like do things in order of how mentally taxing they are. Like
Hmm.
in the morning, I think Anki is probably the most taxing, just because Anki is the most taxing, just because it's the things that you struggle with the most, and you're constantly reinforcing them, and they're like sentences in isolation, which is always harder than in the context of a paragraph. So I think Anki is probably the most mentally taxing, and then reading is probably the second, and then probably watching a show that's kind of difficult or like live action, and then like anime or like an animated show is like probably the easiest. And I kind of do it in that order because that way, like I can get out the reading and the Anki done first, and then I can do the things that are a little less mentally taxing and straining, and so that tends to keep my motivation. And actually, the weird trick was actually the mental trick I did was I have to read to find sentences for Anki because I have to do 10 sentences a day.
Yeah.
That was like my thing, right? And so if I don't read, I'll never find those sentences, which
Right.
of course is backwards because the point of Anki is to help your reading and other skills, not the other way around. But that was kind of the mental trick. Like I have to read because I have to find more sentences and I have to make more Anki cards. And I mean, again, it's more of a mental trick than the actual motivation, but that was one thing. So like reading in the morning definitely helps me, but like reading just before bed, I definitely can't do that because like I could do it in English probably, but I just can't do it in French just because my brain is, it's just too tiring. Like reading is very difficult.
It
It
is.
takes a lot of mental energy, and if you don't do it earlier in the day, for me at least, I probably wouldn't do it at all. So that's what I've done, and it seems to help.
Okay, cool. So I have probably about 10 more minutes. Let's just
Yeah,
open it up to whatever ideas that you have like moving
yeah,
forward. Do you have any
yeah.
questions, comments? What would you?
Yeah, I think like, well, because I think the thing with Romance languages, like there's specific things that are different than Asian languages that maybe would be a good thing to talk about. So I think we've kind of touched on like things like reading is so much easier and how easier it is to get into it and stuff. So maybe not talk about that, but maybe we could talk about grammar a little bit and see
Sure. Yeah, yeah.
our experiences with that. And I'm always fascinated with the idea of grammatical gender and like how well can a monolingual English speaker acquire it versus a native speaker of uh, like a Romance language, for example. So what has your experience been with grammatical gender? Do you think you've acquired grammatical gender to some extent? Do you think only for some words? Do you think it's just purely like Stephen Krashen talks about the monitor thing where you
Right.
just kind of monitor it? You're like, oh, I know this is supposed to be masculine, so you have to make sure the article matches and the adjective matches and all this stuff. So what is your process of understanding grammatical gender? Has it been natural like other parts of the language, or has it been different?
I it's hard. It's hard to say, because gender is there's exceptions to the rule, right? There's
Right.
exceptions in Spanish, but
Yeah.
generally everything follows. If it ends in a, it's feminine. If it ends in o
Right.
or whatever, it's masculine. Um,
Right.
I've acquired it definitely to a certain extent, but the exceptions, some of them just escape me. Sometimes I'll say la agua instead of el agua, which
Right.
is water, which is
Right.
supposed to be simple, but it does escape you sometimes.
Right.
For nouns, yeah, mostly. Um, the thing that kind of trips me up is I don't know what you would call, but it's like of this, from this, it's or to this. Spanish is kind of tricky. Uh,
Like with prepositions, you mean? Or
Prepositions. There you go.
yeah,
See,
okay.
I'm not a grammar nerd at all. Like I don't even consciously study grammar.
Yeah.
So
Have you
yeah,
never looked at like? Do you ever look at grammar resources ever, or look up like what exactly that tense was, or mood, or have you, or is it just purely unconscious for you when you've been
it's purely unconscious. I
studying?
mean, when I first started,
Oh,
I actually don't have the. Yeah, hold on. Let me get this book.
yeah.
So I actually recommended this book because I did read through this book. It's called Barron's Spanish Grammar Guide.
Okay, nice.
Um, I read about 50 pages in, and I was like, okay, this is not the way I could ever keep studying a
Okay.
language, right?
Yeah.
So yeah,
You
I
gotta
mean, I
memorize
don't.
those parts, right?
What was that?
You gotta memorize all those conjugation tables, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So,
Yeah. So there's
like,
no
oh,
way, you know.
no.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of got the gist of it just because I read through it, but
Right.
specific grammar points, I never really look it up. I just kind of, I mean, should maybe, I'm not
Right.
sure yet, but I just don't,
Right.
just because I don't feel like it, you know.
Sure. Yeah.
And
That's
what about
cool.
you?
Yeah, I mean, like,
How does French?
yeah. Well, with grammatical gender, I don't know, but like there definitely are not like there are definitely patterns of grammatical gender with nouns, but I think it's much more random. I feel like there are like for example, if a noun ends with ion, like l'information, like information,
Hmm.
that's feminine typically.
Yeah.
Or there's other examples like that. But honestly, you really can't rely on it that much. It is feels sometimes just very random,
Yeah.
and so you just have to kind of do it one by one. And the advice is always just, oh, just learn the gender with every noun you ever learn.
Hmm.
But of course, that's like oversimplifying it incredibly because it's not like you're
Right.
just learning these nouns for like a test, right?
Yeah.
Like a lot of these words are just cognates that you know already, essentially. So you never have to consciously memorize them. And I tell you this, closed deletions do not work for grammatical gender like at all. You'll get
Okay.
very good at like, you'll get just trust me on this because
Yeah, I will.
you'll get very good at answering those cards, but it
Right.
won't actually seep into your brain. Like you watch like people like on like reality shows, like just ordinary kind of dumb people, honestly, just like talking a mile a minute, perfectly matching the grammatical gender with the adjectives and the articles and stuff, just perfectly, like everything is going so smoothly. Like you're just like, wow, like gender is just so in their bones for every word. It's just there. Like they don't have to think about it. It's completely almost unconscious most of the time, except for some weird spelling rules in the written French. But and so yeah, like that's why like I despair sometimes. I'm like, am I ever actually going to acquire this? But little by little, like I think if you just focus on noticing it, like
Hmm.
as much as you can, if you notice it, little by little, your brain will always be like, oh, this article always goes with that word. Like, for example, house in French is maison. So you always hear, there's another ION word actually, but you always hear it
Yeah.
as la maison. And so
Nice.
it's feminine. And you
Hmm.
just like, oh, after a while, it just kind of does sort of seep into your bones, I think. If you try and notice it, like you don't have to memorize it because
Right.
I don't think memorization really seeps in my opinion, for grammatical gender, really. And so I think it does seem to be little by little like slipping in, mostly from the listening, actually, not really from reading, because you read so many words when you're reading that I feel like it just goes at like a mile a minute and they just kind of slip past you. But when you're listening and you really like, all of a sudden you're like, oh, I heard that article. I know that's masculine or that's feminine, and you heard that adjective agree with the noun and stuff, and you're like, I feel like I actually like acquired that one word, but no other word. It's just that one word's grammatical gender. So it does feel like little by little it does slip in, but I do know that like uh, like grammatical gender is a very difficult thing to fully acquire for English speakers learning another language. Like they've done studies and like compared to like verbs, for example, verbs are so easy because you have to understand them and like in compare like yeah, like things like the subjunctive that we sort of have in English, but it can be tricky, and I think it's even trickier actually in Spanish than French. But like after a while though, you just like hear like these like phrases, and you just know that when you say this first, you typically will say this next, and you just learn it that way, I think, and that's just is what it is. You're not memorizing tables because that will never work. But yeah, but yeah, because you just mentioned the subjunctive and grammar, and I would say like verbs have been in a way very easy just because you just kind of pay attention and you just kind of pick them up over time, especially if you're listening a lot and reading, and you don't have to memorize the tables ever really. And yeah, once in a while you'll make a mistake, but things like subjunctive and even like the like literary tenses that don't show up in the spoken language, little by like some subjunctive forms in French only really show up in old novels, and they just become easy after a while. Like you just get used to them. Same thing with like yeah, like verbs I don't think are really a problem. They just require a lot of exposure. But yeah, the grammatical gender thing, sometimes I've scratched my head on like, is this something like also one thing, I don't think colors work. I know some people talk about like color coding nouns, for example, in Anki cards. I don't think that makes any sense in my opinion, just because are you really going to be memorizing these mnemonic colors and then actually applying that when you talk? I'm a little skeptical. I tried it for like a day and I hated it, so I stopped doing it. But so I can't confirm exactly that it won't work, but I'm very skeptical, especially because all these words you learn that you'll never make an Anki card for. Like, how are we going to deal with those? So,
Gotcha.
that's my rant about grammatical gender. But I don't know if you have any other thoughts about grammar or vocabulary. Oh, actually, one last thing I'll say before we run out of time quickly is because you had your guest last episode. You talked about reading and how he hadn't got into it yet, and I'm kind of I guess a reading guy, I guess apparently. So what I'll say is try to get into reading earlier than you think, because there's this idea that I think one of the biggest lies in reading is that you need to know 98% of the vocabulary before you can actually read it. Otherwise, you'll be inefficient or something.
Right.
And people talk about that like that's a proven fact, but there's no study that has ever shown that ever, like not even attempted to show it. And like they'll say 98% to show that you comprehend it. Like you need that to comprehend something well, but it has nothing to do with whether you can learn from it. So what I would say is really try and get into try not to be discouraged when the first page or chapter is really hard, because the first 50 pages are going to be kind of rough no matter what you read, but after those first 50 pages it's going to be so much easier to read after that. And so try not to get discouraged when you first start a book. Yeah, some books are just legitimately going to be too difficult. Like you could force yourself through it, but it's probably not worth it. But I would say give a book 50 pages, look up words 1 or 2 or 3 times a page, sentence mine as you go would be a great thing to do as well. Like sentence mining plus reading is like super powerful, but try not to give up before those first 50 pages. If after 50 pages you're like, this is still really hard and boring, you have my permission to give up. But before that, just give it a chance, because your brain will slowly get used to it. Just like when you're listening. When you watch a TV show, that first episode's going to be rough. You're not used to their voices yet. But after like 10 hours, it becomes so much easier. And it really is similar, I think, to reading. So that's what I'd say about reading.
Yeah, I'd back that up. It really is a subconscious process, and it's kind of hard to kind of track your subconscious progress. But have faith in the process, and that would be my advice. And I'm sure you're nodding your head. I'm sure you agree with it. So I guess final question before we wrap up, and I think we should do like a part 2, fleshing out more differences between Spanish and French when we can. I'm sorry you have to run, but would you have any final parting advice? I know you just kind of gave some, but any final comments or just
I think that you actually mentioned it before, but there's this difficulty of finding content in your target language that you might like. And I think like people who study Japanese have it so easy because they probably already like anime. They have like
Yeah,
tons of these shows that they already love that they can just
exactly.
watch. Whereas French, like I don't know what's good in French TV. I have to like try all these shows and that I don't, and like I have to find these weird services that might have these episodes on them. Like maybe this will be good. I don't know. Like what is good? A good French movie? I have no idea. Like books are a little bit easier just because there's a lot of French books that are very famous, but
Right.
it is about language learning, and it is just a journey. It's just trying to discover what is interesting, and that's actually also pretty exciting too, because you can, and like having an open mind about these kind of things, I think is also very important. Like maybe I won't like, try that show that you're like, oh, I wouldn't watch it in English, but maybe you would actually like it in Spanish or French, and just give it a shot. Like, and that's probably one of the most rewarding things. You get to kind of explore what actually is good in French or Spanish or Russian. What is good TV versus bad TV, and starting developing your taste in the language, I think is super important. Whether you're reading or listening, and instead of just watching dub content, try to explore the culture a little bit. I think it's very rewarding. I think.
Awesome. I mean, hey man, it's been an awesome conversation. I've actually learned a lot. Especially, I loved your take on reading. It's kind of motivated me
Yeah.
to kind of kick my ass in gear with it too. So
30 minutes a day. 30 minutes a day goes a long, long way. I promise.
right,
Like it really does.
right.
To do that every day, and it'll add up definitely.
Awesome, man. Well, I'll take your advice, and I hope people find value with this. I mean, I did, and I've been doing MIA for what 2 years now, so 2.5 years. All right,
fun.
man. Yeah, it was awesome. It was
right.
awesome. So I'll link Justin's channel. I don't. Are you gonna be uploading any more updates on your channel coming
Yeah,
up?
I plan. It's hard because like I want to do a lot of listening practice, but then I also have
Yeah.
to like record my update, right? So
Right.
this is like it's the tension, right? But probably next few days I'll probably record my official 1 year update on MIA just to
Awesome.
explain. I kind of already talked about it already, but to go into a lot more depth of the things I've done and my level and stuff, so people can look forward to that.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it, man. Well, yeah, I guess we're signing off now. I'm gonna stop recording.
All right,
Ciao, everyone.
all right, thanks.
Hasta luego.